In 1973, a McDonald's hamburger cost 25 cents. The dining room was thick with cigarette smoke, and the kid wrapping your food had never once been told to wash his hands. Here are 30 things about fast food restaurants in 1970s America that nobody questioned at the time. Every French fry you ate at McDonald's in the 1970s was cooked in a blend called Formula 47, named after the combined 47-cent price of a burger, fries, and a shake. The formula was 93% rendered beef tallow and 7% cottonseed oil, supplied by a Chicago company called Interstate Foods. The fat came from the stockyards, and it gave the fries their golden exterior and rich, buttery taste that people still talk about decades later. Burger King, Wendy's, and nearly every other chain used similar animal fat blends. There were no trans fat labels, no cholesterol warnings, no nutritional breakdown posted anywhere. You ordered your fries, and they came out of a vat of liquefied animal fat heated past 350 degrees, served with no information about what you were eating. The shift away from beef tallow did not come until 1990, and what replaced it, hydrogenated vegetable oil loaded with trans fats, turned out to be worse. If you walked into a Burger King in 1974, the first thing that hit you was not the smell of burgers, but of cigarettes. Ashtrays sat on every table between the ketchup packets and the napkin dispensers. Parents smoked while their kids ate. Employees worked entire shifts breathing secondhand smoke from every booth. Berkeley, California became the first city in America to limit indoor restaurant smoking in 1977, and even that law only required designated areas. Minnesota passed the Indoor Clean Air Act in 1975, but most states had nothing. The tobacco industry fought every restriction, and fast food chains backed them, arguing that bans would drive away customers. A nationwide restaurant smoking ban did not arrive for decades. For all of the 1970s, your kids sat 3 feet from a stranger's lit Marlboro while eating their food in a haze of known carcinogens, and that was considered completely acceptable. Not a single fast food restaurant in the 1970s told you what was in your food. No calorie counts on the menu board, no fat content on the wrapper, no sodium levels printed anywhere. The Nutrition Labeling and Education Act did not pass until 1990. A Big Mac contained over 500 calories, more than 1,000 milligrams of sodium, and 26 grams of fat, and the only way to know that was to hire a chemist. A full meal with a burger, large fries, and a shake easily exceeded 1,500 calories and 2 days' worth of sodium. Families ate these meals multiple times a week while heart disease climbed every year, and no one drew the connection because the data was hidden. The menus showed pictures and prices. That was all you got. McDonald's tested its first playland at the 1972 Illinois State Fair, a sprawling playground where kids climbed on welded steel structures shaped like Officer Big Mac and the Hamburglar. The surfaces were painted in bright enamel that absorbed direct sunlight, and on summer days, those metal slides reached temperatures high enough to cause second-degree burns on bare skin. The ground beneath was asphalt or compacted dirt, nothing designed to absorb a fall. The first permanent playland opened in Chula Vista, California, boosting that location's business by 60%. McDonald's installed them nationwide, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission later documented more than 400 child injuries on the Big Mac climber alone, including nearly 20 concussions or skull fractures and 80 broken bones. The company failed to report those injuries to federal regulators, and the equipment was not fully removed until 1997. Before those metal playgrounds finished injuring kids outside, the packaging inside was doing its own quiet damage. In 1974, a businessman named John Huntsman Sr. invented the polystyrene foam clamshell and pitched it to fast food chains as the future of food packaging. Burger King tried it first. When sales jumped, McDonald's followed. By the late 70s, every hot sandwich and every cup of coffee came in a polystyrene container made from styrene monomer, a chemical the National Toxicology Program would later classify as reasonably anticipated to cause cancer. When hot food sat inside those thin foam walls, trace amounts of styrene migrated into the meal. Nobody tested for it. Nobody was required to. The foam was cheap, it kept food warm, and it was everywhere. Environmental pressure finally forced McDonald's to phase out the clamshells in 1990, but the concern was landfill waste. not what had been leaching into your lunch for 15 years. The Occupational Safety and Health Act became law in 1970, creating OSHA. But the new agency did almost nothing to protect the teenagers pulling fry baskets at every chain in the country. Kids as young as 14 worked the fryer station, standing over open vats of oil heated past 350 degrees, with no splash guards and no automatic lowering baskets. Federal labor law prohibited workers under 16 from cooking, but enforcement was nearly non-existent, and managers routinely ignored the rules during dinner rushes. The CDC found that adolescents in restaurants were 6 times more likely to suffer burn injuries than teens in any other industry, and nearly half of all those burns came from hot grease. Speed always came before safety. These kids had no union, no advocate, and in most cases no understanding of what their legal rights were. The FDA Food Code, the federal guideline that standardized food safety practices for restaurants, did not exist until 1993. In the 70s, hand-washing requirements were a loose patchwork of state and local rules that varied from one county to the next. Some places required a sign in the restroom. Most enforced nothing. The teenager assembling your Whopper may have handled raw ground beef, mopped a floor with industrial cleaner, taken out bags of garbage, and then wrapped your sandwich without washing his hands once, because nobody had trained him and no inspector was watching. The connection between poor hand hygiene and outbreaks of Salmonella, hepatitis A, and Shigella was well understood by public health researchers, but that knowledge had not been translated into enforceable rules for the places where most Americans were actually eating. There was no system to verify food safety. You trusted the process because you had to. The bright red in your fast food strawberry milkshake came from red dye number 2, a synthetic petroleum-based coloring and the most common food dye in America by 1970. Soviet scientists published a study in 1971 linking it to tumors in rats. The FDA took 5 years to act, finally pulling it from the market in 1976, not because they proved it caused cancer in humans, but because no one could prove it safe. Products worth more than $10 million a year contained the dye. The panic was so widespread that Mars temporarily pulled red M&Ms from shelves, even though they never contained red dye number 2 in the first place. For the better part of the decade, Americans consumed a suspected carcinogen in everything from ice cream to sausage casings, and the only reason anyone found out was a study from Moscow. Drive-through windows became common at fast food chains in the 1970s, and long lines of idling cars came with them. In 1973, the average car still ran on leaded gasoline, and the exhaust contained lead particles, carbon monoxide, and unburned hydrocarbons. The EPA phase-out of leaded fuel had barely begun. Catalytic converters were not required until 1975. Every car idling in a drive-through lane pumped toxins into air that drifted through the pickup window and into the building. Workers at those windows breathed fumes for entire shifts. Families behind kept their windows down in the summer, kids inhaling exhaust from the car ahead. California did not adopt a plan to reduce drive-through idling emissions until 1989, 16 years after the line started forming. Nobody measured air quality in a drive-through lane in the 70s, because the question had not occurred to anyone. Thousands of fast food restaurants built in the 70s used standard commercial construction materials, and that included asbestos. It lined the walls, filled the ceiling tiles, hid inside vinyl floor tiles beneath the booths, and coated the fireproofing around kitchen ductwork. The EPA banned spray-on asbestos insulation in 1973, but buildings already standing were not required to remove it. Those restaurants stayed open for decades with the material intact, and every renovation, every kitchen remodel risked releasing invisible fibers into the air that workers and customers breathed. OSHA set exposure limits in '71, but the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health would eventually conclude there was no safe level of asbestos exposure at all. If the asbestos in the walls was invisible, the chemicals added to the food were equally hidden. By 1969, American companies produced 58 million pounds of monosodium glutamate per year, and fast food chains used it freely in seasoning blends, sauces, breading, and soup bases with no requirement to disclose it on a menu. The compound had been sold under brand names like Accent since the 40s, advertised as pure monosodium glutamate that makes food flavors sing. But in 1968, a letter in the New England Journal of Medicine described numbness, palpitations, and weakness after meals at Chinese restaurants, and the resulting hysteria, steeped in racial bias and weak science, overshadowed a legitimate question. A powerful flavor enhancer was being added to processed food in enormous quantities, and consumers had no idea how much they were eating. Fast food chains had no obligation to tell them. Every hot dog, every strip of bacon, and every slice of ham on a fast food breakfast platter was preserved with sodium nitrite, a compound that kept processed meat pink and prevented botulism. The Egg McMuffin launched nationally in 1975, and breakfast menus heavy with bacon, sausage, and Canadian ham became a major profit center across the industry. What no customer was told was that sodium nitrite, when heated or mixed with stomach acid, could form nitrosamines, compounds that decades of research would link to stomach and colorectal cancer. The World Health Organization eventually placed processed meat in its Group 1 carcinogen category, alongside tobacco and asbestos, based largely on the nitrite connection. In the 1970s, the early research was already raising questions, but the fast food industry had no legal obligation to share any of it with the public. The preservative was cheap, it worked, and it went into virtually everything served before noon. BHA and BHT were in everything. These synthetic preservatives, butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene, were added to fry oils, bun formulations, breakfast pastries, and virtually every shelf-stable item in the fast food supply chain to prevent fats from going rancid. In 1974, the National Cancer Institute published a report showing that both compounds produced tumors in laboratory rodents. The findings did not lead to a ban. The FDA kept BHA and BHT on its generally recognized as safe list, even as the National Toxicology Program flagged BHA as reasonably anticipated to be a human carcinogen. The European Union and Japan eventually restricted or prohibited both additives. But in the United States, they remained legal, unregulated in quantity, and unlabeled on any fast food packaging. Every time you bit into a Burger King apple pie or a McDonald's hash brown in the 70s, you were consuming preservatives that a federal agency had linked to cancer and that 2 other countries would eventually refuse to allow in food. In the 1970s, there was no standardized system for monitoring the temperature of food inside a fast food restaurant. The Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points framework, known as HACCP, did not become a regulatory requirement until the 1990s. Before that, whether a walk-in cooler held ground beef at a safe temperature or let it drift into the bacterial danger zone between 40 and 140 degrees was largely a matter of chance and individual judgment. There were no digital thermometers logging temperatures every hour. There were no alarms when a cooler failed overnight. A manager might check once a shift, or not at all. Patties sat on counters waiting for the lunch rush. Prepped lettuce and tomato sat in bins under heat lamps. The CDC estimates that foodborne illness affected millions of Americans annually during this period. But the tracking infrastructure to connect those illnesses back to specific restaurants barely existed. What made the transition from kitchen hazards to the dining room even stranger was what they gave your kids to play with while they ate. McDonald's rolled out the Happy Meal nationally in 1979, and the toys packed inside became instant collectibles. But the small parts regulations that exist today were just being written. The Consumer Product Safety Commission finalized its small parts rule in 1979, the same year the Happy Meal launched, which meant the earliest toys were designed and manufactured before those standards applied. Tiny plastic figurines, small detachable wheels, and thin metal clips were common. The concept of testing a toy to see whether it could fit inside a child's throat was not yet standard industry practice. Burger King and other chains followed with their own kids' meal promotions, each packed with trinkets designed to be cheap, bright, and appealing to toddlers who put everything in their mouths. Choking was the leading cause of injury-related death in kids under 4, and the toys being handed out with burgers were exactly the size and shape most likely to cause it. Long before anyone worried about trans fats, every fast food pie, pastry, and biscuit was made with either pure lard or partially hydrogenated vegetable shortening, often both. McDonald's fried apple pies, introduced in 1968 and a bestseller throughout the 70s, were deep-fried in the same beef tallow blend used for French fries, and the crust itself contained hydrogenated shortening. A single pie could deliver more saturated fat than a cheeseburger. Crisco, the dominant shortening brand, had been marketed to American housewives since 1911 as a cleaner, more modern alternative to animal fat, but it was loaded with trans fatty acids that nobody was measuring. Fast food chains bought hydrogenated shortening by the barrel because it was cheap and shelf-stable. The idea that these fats might be actively damaging arterial walls was not part of any public conversation, and it would not be for another 2 decades. DDT was banned for agricultural use in the United States in 1972, but that did not mean it vanished from the food supply. The pesticide was extraordinarily persistent, accumulating in soil for years and concentrating in animal fat as it moved up the food chain. Cattle grazing on contaminated pasture land stored DDT and its breakdown products in their body fat, and that fat ended up in the ground beef patties served at every fast food counter in America. USDA monitoring throughout the 70s continued to detect DDT residues in beef and dairy products. The levels were declining, but they were not zero. A child eating a fast food hamburger in 1975 was consuming trace amounts of a pesticide that had already been linked to cancer, reproductive harm, and liver damage, a chemical banned precisely because it would not stop showing up in the things people ate. The pests inside the restaurant were dealt with using chemicals almost as concerning as the ones in the food. Chlordane, a powerful organochlorine insecticide, was one of the most popular commercial pest control products used in restaurants and food service buildings through the 1970s. It was sprayed along baseboards, behind fryers, under sinks, and around the perimeter of storage rooms where the flour and buns were kept. The EPA did not ban chlordane for indoor use until 1988, 16 years after DDT was pulled from agricultural fields. Diazinon, another common restaurant pesticide, was not restricted for indoor applications until 2004. In the meantime, these neurotoxic compounds were applied in the same rooms where food was prepared and served, often by the restaurant staff themselves, with no protective gear and no requirement to notify customers. The roaches got the poison. So did everything else in the kitchen. Self-serve soda fountains started appearing in fast food restaurants in the late 1970s, and they were an immediate hit with customers who wanted free refills. What nobody discussed was what was growing inside the machines. The nozzles dispensed syrup and carbonated water through narrow plastic channels that stayed warm and moist all day, an ideal breeding ground for mold, yeast, and coliform bacteria. Cleaning protocols, where they existed, were left entirely to the discretion of the individual restaurant. There was no federal requirement to disassemble and sanitize the dispensing heads on any schedule. Studies conducted years later found that a significant percentage of fountain drink nozzles tested positive for bacteria associated with fecal contamination. In the 70s, nobody was running those tests. You filled your cup, you drank your Coke, and you never looked at the nozzle. If the soda machines went unchecked, so did something far more dangerous: the complete absence of allergen awareness in every fast food kitchen in America. The Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act did not become law until 2004. In the 70s, there were no allergen warnings on menus, no ingredient lists available to customers, and no training for staff on cross-contamination. Peanut oil was used in fryers without disclosure. Wheat, soy, eggs, and dairy were in sauces, batters, and buns with no way for a customer to know. The EpiPen auto-injector did not reach the market until 1987, which meant that throughout the 70s, a person experiencing anaphylaxis in a fast food restaurant had to hope someone nearby knew what was happening and could get them to a hospital. The industry treated food allergies as a personal problem, not a safety issue, and the law agreed. Every single fried item on a 1970s fast food menu contained trans fats, and not one customer in America knew it. Partially hydrogenated vegetable oils were the standard frying and baking fat across the industry, used in fryers, shortening, margarine, and bun formulations. The hydrogenation process that made these oils shelf-stable also created artificial trans fatty acids, which decades of subsequent research would identify as the single most dangerous type of dietary fat. Worse than saturated fat, worse than cholesterol, directly linked to coronary heart disease, stroke, and type 2 diabetes. The FDA did not require trans fat content on nutrition labels until 2006 and did not finalize a ban on partially hydrogenated oils until 2015. For the entire decade of the 70s, and for decades after, Americans consumed these fats at every meal without a single label, a single warning, or a single public statement from the companies that knew what their oil contained. The ground beef in your fast food hamburger in the 1970s came with no label telling you what was in it. There were no fat content disclosures, no lean-to-fat ratios printed on packaging, and no federal standard limiting how much fat a fast food patty could contain. USDA rules for ground beef labeling were minimal, and they applied to retail grocery products, not to the bulk shipments that went directly to restaurant chains. A patty advertised as a quarter-pounder referred to the pre-cooked weight, and as it hit the flat grill, rendered fat pooled around it in quantities that told you more than any menu ever would. Some industry estimates placed the fat content of fast food burger patties in the range of 25 to 30%. You had no way to confirm or dispute that number. The patty weighed what it weighed before cooking, it cost what the menu said, and everything else was a mystery the industry preferred to keep. Above every booth and every kitchen station in a 1970s fast food restaurant, fluorescent light fixtures hummed behind plastic diffuser panels. Inside those fixtures, the ballasts that regulated electrical current were filled with polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, a class of synthetic chemicals used for their heat resistance and electrical insulating properties. PCBs were already known to cause liver damage and were suspected carcinogens, but the EPA did not ban their manufacture until 1979, and existing equipment was not required to be replaced. When a ballast failed, and they failed often, the PCB fluid could leak onto ceiling tiles, drip into light covers, and in some cases seep down onto surfaces below. Fast food workers changed those tubes and handled those ballasts with bare hands. Nobody told them what was inside. The Big Mac Climber was a raised steel platform shaped like a giant hamburger, welded together and bolted into the concrete at McDonald's playlands across the country. It stood over 6 feet high, with narrow metal rungs and open sides positioned above asphalt or packed earth. From the 1970s through the late 80s, the Consumer Product Safety Commission documented more than 400 injuries to kids who fell from the structure, including 80 broken bones and nearly 20 skull fractures or concussions. McDonald's was legally required to report product-related injuries to the CPSC, and the company did not. When federal regulators finally caught up, McDonald's had already been caught once before for failing to report injuries on a different piece of equipment, the tug-and-turn merry-go-round. The company paid a $4 million settlement and agreed to remove every remaining climber. The last one was not scrapped until 1997, a quarter century after the first child fell. The recklessness of the playground extended right back inside the restaurant, down to the paint on the furniture your toddler was chewing on. Lead-based paint was not banned for residential use in the United States until 1978, and commercial applications were even slower to change. Fast food restaurants built or renovated before the ban used lead paint on high chairs, booth seats, window frames, and interior trim. Young kids, the same ones sitting in those high chairs gnawing on the wooden armrests, were the most vulnerable. Lead paint chips had a slightly sweet taste, which made them attractive to toddlers who put everything in their mouths. Even microscopic amounts of lead exposure could cause developmental delays, behavioral problems, and irreversible neurological damage. The CDC would eventually conclude that no level of lead exposure was safe for a child. In the 70s, those high chairs were just furniture, and nobody thought to ask what color they were painted with. Dr. Henry Heimlich published his abdominal thrust technique in 1974, and it quickly became recognized as the most effective response to a choking emergency. But there was no law requiring restaurant staff to learn it. Fast food chains employed hundreds of thousands of workers across the country, many of them teenagers, and not one was required to complete any form of first aid or choking response training before handling food and serving customers. Choking was, and remains, a leading cause of accidental death in restaurant settings, particularly among young kids eating hot dogs and older adults eating meat. If someone choked in a McDonald's in 1976, the only hope was that another customer in the dining room happened to know what to do. The staff behind the counter had been trained to make a quarter pounder in under 90 seconds. Nobody had trained them to save a life. The burn injuries were not accidents. They were a predictable outcome of putting untrained miners next to unguarded commercial cooking equipment in a high-pressure environment. Fast food kitchens in the 70s operated with open-top fryers that had no splash shields, no automatic basket mechanisms, and no temperature lockouts. A 14-year-old pulling a wire basket from a vat of 350-degree oil had nothing between the grease and bare forearms. Spills happened when ice crystals from frozen fries hit the oil and sent it erupting over the edge. OSHA existed, but its inspectors were stretched across every industry in the country, and a fast food kitchen was low priority. The burns kept happening, shift after shift, and the exposed fryer design did not change for years. Automatic lowering baskets and enclosed systems came later, after a generation of teenage workers had already paid the price. In the 1970s, the cars idling in drive-through lanes ran on leaded gasoline, lacked catalytic converters, and produced carbon monoxide at levels modern vehicles cannot approach. Pre-1975 automobiles emitted roughly 10 times the CO of a car built after emission standards took hold. On a busy evening, a dozen or more of these vehicles sat bumper to bumper in a lane, engines running, windows cracked, while families waited for their food. CO is colorless and odorless, and at low concentrations causes headaches, dizziness, and nausea, symptoms easily mistaken for hunger or fatigue. Workers at the drive-through window inhaled those fumes for hours. Nobody monitored CO levels in a drive-through lane. Nobody posted a warning. Ventilation was never part of the blueprint. The soft-serve ice cream machine was one of the most popular features of any fast food restaurant in the 1970s, and one of the filthiest pieces of equipment in the building. The machines held liquid dairy mix in a hopper at temperatures just above freezing, then churned it through a freezing barrel. The problem was the gap between hopper and barrel, a warm, moist space where milk residue collected and bacteria flourished. Listeria, salmonella, and coliform organisms colonized internal tubing if the machine was not disassembled and sanitized on a strict schedule. There was no federal cleaning standard for these machines, and many locations only cleaned them when the product tasted wrong or the health inspector showed up. The swirl on your cone looked perfect. What was growing in the pipes behind it was another matter entirely. There was no uniform federal food safety inspection standard for restaurants in the 1970s. Health inspections were conducted by local and county agencies whose rigor depended entirely on geography. One county might inspect twice a year with a detailed checklist. The next might not inspect at all. Grading systems were not standardized and were not required to be posted where customers could see them. A fast food chain could operate thousands of locations across dozens of jurisdictions, each subject to different rules, different enforcement, and different definitions of what counted as a violation. The FDA published advisory guidelines, but they had no force of law. The system supposed to protect the public was as fragmented and unreliable as the food it was meant to oversee. Drive-in restaurants with car hops on roller skates were icons of the 1970s, where teenage servers glided across parking lots balancing trays of burgers, fries, and milkshakes. Customers loved the spectacle, honking horns and flashing headlights to summon their orders while watching skaters weave between cars. The uniforms were cute, the skates were fast, and the experience felt like something out of a movie celebrating youth and carefree summer evenings. What nobody discussed was how dangerous the job was, with servers navigating uneven pavement, oil slicks, distracted drivers, and heavy trays that could send them sprawling at the slightest wobble. Falls happened constantly, resulting in broken wrists and sprained ankles that workers shrugged off because complaining meant losing shifts. Insurance companies eventually noticed the claims piling up, and liability concerns began shutting down skating service at restaurant after restaurant. Today, the few drive-ins that remain mostly use walking servers or window pickup, and the image of a smiling car hop on roller skates lives primarily in nostalgic photographs. The charm of skating could not survive workplace injury costs. Bonanza Steakhouse promised all you can eat and meant every word of it, which made it a sanctuary for families who rarely got to eat without counting bites or measuring portions. The salad bar alone could fill a plate 3 times over with shredded cheese, sunflower seeds, pickled beets, and enough ranch dressing to drown a small boat. Parents ordered sirloin tips or chopped steak, knowing the real value was in the trips back to the buffet, piling high the mashed potatoes and warm dinner rolls that stretched the meal into something truly filling. Kids discovered the joy of soft-serve ice cream dispensers, learning to swirl chocolate and vanilla together until the bowl overflowed onto the tray below. The dining room was always louder than expected, full of families laughing, babies fussing, and the constant clatter of plates being cleared and reset by tired but friendly staff. Nobody dressed up for Bonanza because nobody needed to, and that casual atmosphere made even the tightest budget feel generous. For families who measured groceries carefully every single week, Bonanza was a rare chance to eat freely, to forget the math for one evening, and just enjoy the feeling of being completely full. Diners with lead paint on soda fountain equipment were far more common than anyone realized in the 1970s, when those gleaming chrome dispensers and colorful tap handles often concealed layers of toxic paint beneath their shiny surfaces. Customers bellied up to lunch counters and ordered cherry cokes, root beer floats, and fizzy phosphates without imagining that the equipment delivering their drinks might be poisoning them. The paint made machinery look cheerful and inviting, matching the bright decor that defined the era's diners and drugstore counters. Restaurant owners repainted equipment regularly, layering new coats over old without stripping down to bare metal. Nobody tested for lead because nobody thought to ask. Children wrapped their lips around straws inches from painted surfaces, and soda jerks handled equipment all day without gloves. When researchers connected lead exposure to serious health problems, regulations swept through the industry demanding lead-free finishes on anything that touched food or drink. The cheerful paint that once brightened soda fountains became evidence of an era that prioritized appearance over the invisible dangers lurking beneath. Denny's was the place that never closed, a beacon of fluorescent light and bottomless coffee at every hour of the day or night, no matter the weather or the season. Families stumbled in after late drives, early mornings, or those strange in-between hours when nothing else was open, and hunger could not wait another minute. The Grand Slam breakfast was legendary, a plate piled with eggs, pancakes, bacon, and sausage for a price that seemed almost too good to be true. Kids colored on paper placemats while parents nursed cups of coffee and planned the next stretch of highway or the coming week of work and worry. The menu was enormous, laminated, and slightly sticky from years of syrup-covered fingers flipping through the pages. Nobody judged you for ordering breakfast at midnight or dinner at dawn because Denny's understood that life did not always follow a convenient schedule. For families who worked odd shifts, traveled on tight budgets, or simply needed a warm place to gather when everywhere else had locked its doors, Denny's was always there waiting with the lights on. It was not fancy, but it was faithful, and sometimes that mattered more than anything else. Flambéed desserts performed without fire. Safety measures were the sparkling finale to countless dinners in the 1970s, when waiters carried pans of liquor-soaked fruit right to your table and set them ablaze with theatrical confidence. The flames leaped high, casting warm orange light across delighted diners who leaned in close to watch the show. Restaurants saw these performances as marks of sophistication. Nobody checked whether the tablecloth was fire-resistant, whether the ceiling was high enough, or whether the server had any formal training beyond watching someone else do it. Families gathered as cherries jubilee or bananas foster erupted in controlled bursts of fire inches from their hair and flammable clothing. The smell of caramelized sugar and burning alcohol filled the room, and everyone applauded when the flames died down. Today, fire codes and insurance companies have made these performances far more complicated, requiring permits, extinguishers, and safety protocols that strip much of the spontaneity away. The idea of an untrained waiter igniting alcohol near seated guests now seems reckless, but back then it was simply dinner with a show. Pizza Hut was the red-roofed headquarters of Friday night celebrations, the place where families gathered around checkered tablecloths and pitchers of soda to mark the end of another long week. The pan pizza arrived in cast-iron skillets, the cheese still bubbling and the crust golden brown in a way that home ovens could never quite replicate. Kids earned personal pan pizzas through reading programs at school, carrying their certificates like golden tickets into restaurants where they could order something all their own. The salad bar was an afterthought for most, but parents loaded plates with iceberg lettuce and croutons to stretch the meal a little further. The arcade games in the corner swallowed quarters while families waited for their orders, the sounds of Pac-Man and pinball mixing with laughter and conversation. Birthday parties meant long tables, pitchers of root beer, and cakes that arrived with candles already lit. For families who could not afford much else, Pizza Hut was the reward at the end of the tunnel, a place where everyone ate well and nobody felt poor. The red roof became a symbol of small victories and shared meals that stayed warm in memory. All-you-can-eat raw oyster bars with no health warnings were coastal treasures in the 1970s, drawing crowds who slurped down dozens of briny shellfish without anyone mentioning the risks lurking inside each shell. Restaurants stacked oysters on ice and let customers consume as many as their stomachs could hold, charging one flat price for unlimited access. People treated it like a competition, bragging about how many they could eat while servers shucked fresh batches to keep pace. Nobody posted signs about bacteria, nobody warned about compromised immune systems, and nobody tracked how long those oysters had been sitting out. The ice looked clean, the shells glistened, and that was enough reassurance for most diners. What people did not realize was that raw oysters could harbor Vibrio bacteria capable of causing severe illness. Today, restaurants are required to display health warnings about raw shellfish consumption, and unlimited raw bars face strict oversight. The carefree oyster feasts of the 70s have given way to cautious disclaimers and portion tracking that would have seemed absurd to anyone raising a shell back then. Sizzler had a way of making Friday nights feel like something worth looking forward to, even when the budget barely stretched past the gas bill. The moment you walked through those doors, the sizzle of hot platters and the sight of the salad bar stretching toward the back wall made everything else fade away. Families ordered the cheapest steak on the menu and then made up for it by loading plates with bacon bits, cottage cheese, pasta salad, and anything else the buffet offered. Kids loved building towers of croutons and drowning iceberg lettuce in ranch dressing, while parents lingered over coffee and quiet conversation. There was a pride in feeding everyone well, even if the wallets were thin, and Sizzler understood that without ever saying a word. The booths were vinyl, the lighting a little too bright, and the carpet carried the faint memory of 1,000 spilled sodas. But none of that mattered when the whole family sat together, sharing a meal that felt generous even when it was carefully calculated. Sizzler gave people permission to enjoy themselves, and that was worth more than any fancy steakhouse ever could. Rare hamburgers served to anyone without cooking warnings were a point of pride at diners and steakhouses in the 1970s, cooked to whatever doneness the customer requested without a single disclaimer. People ordered their burgers pink in the middle, believing the beef was fresh enough and the kitchen skilled enough to make it safe. Servers wrote down orders without mentioning bacteria, without explaining risks, and without offering any alternative to customers who might not understand what rare ground beef actually meant. Children ate these burgers alongside adults, trusting that anything served at a restaurant had been vetted for safety. Restaurants ground their own meat or received it from suppliers with minimal oversight, and the idea of E. coli lurking inside a medium-rare patty simply did not enter public conversation. Families returned week after week, ordering the same pink burgers that tasted juicy without ever considering the gamble they were taking. Today, menus carry warnings about consuming raw or undercooked meat, and many jurisdictions require restaurants to inform customers about the risks. The freely served rare burger of the 70s now comes wrapped in legal disclaimers. Western Sizzlin' was the heartbeat of budget dining across the South, the kind of restaurant where working families could sit down to real food without pretending to be something they were not. The buffet line was legendary, piled high with fried chicken, meatloaf, collard greens, and cornbread that tasted like someone's grandmother had been cooking since dawn. Parents appreciated the honesty of the place, how nobody dressed up or expected fancy manners, and how the staff treated every customer like a neighbor who had just stopped by. Kids ran between the dessert station and the ice cream machine, filling plates with banana pudding and soft serve until their stomachs could hold no more. The dining room buzzed with conversation, babies crying, and the clatter of silverware against heavy ceramic plates that had seen 1,000 family dinners. For families who worked long hours just to keep the lights on and the rent paid, Western Sizzlin' was a small reward, a chance to eat without worrying about the check. It was community, comfort, and calories all wrapped into one affordable evening that stayed with people long after the restaurant doors finally closed for good. Restaurants without accessible entrances or restrooms were simply the norm in the 1970s, designed without a single thought for customers who used wheelchairs, walkers, or any mobility assistance. Steps led up to front doors, narrow aisles wound between tightly packed tables, and restrooms hid behind heavy doors at the end of cramped hallways. People with disabilities were often told to wait outside while companions fetched takeout, or they avoided dining out altogether. Owners saw no reason to change layouts that had worked for decades, viewing accessibility as an unnecessary expense rather than a basic right. Families with disabled members learned which restaurants to avoid, passing that knowledge quietly like a secret map of exclusion. The idea that a business should welcome everyone equally had not yet taken hold, and regulations did not exist to force the issue. Today, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires ramps, wide doorways, accessible seating, and compliant restrooms in every restaurant. The dining rooms that once locked out entire segments of the population have been redesigned, rebuilt, or shut down for failing to meet standards that seemed radical in the 70s. Chi-Chi's brought Mexican food to strip malls across America and made it feel like a party every single time. Families walked in to the sound of sizzling fajitas being carried overhead and the sight of oversized sombreros decorating every wall. Parents ordered combination plates piled with rice, beans, enchiladas, and tacos, knowing the portions were big enough to feed kids from the leftovers if needed. The chips and salsa arrived before anyone even opened a menu, and kids crunched through basket after basket while parents sipped margaritas or sweet tea. Birthdays meant the whole staff gathering around to sing while someone wore a sombrero and blushed through the attention. The fried ice cream at the end of the meal was the real treasure, a crispy shell of sweetness that made every visit feel complete. For families who could not afford vacations, Chi-Chi's was the closest thing to an escape, a place where bright colors, loud music, and generous portions made everyone feel like guests at a fiesta. It was celebration dining on a shoestring budget, and nobody ever forgot the way it made ordinary weeks feel special. Tableside Caesar salad prepared with raw egg yolks was one of the most theatrical dining experiences of the 1970s, performed by waiters who cracked fresh eggs directly into wooden bowls while guests watched in admiration. The ritual felt elegant as the server whisked the yolk into anchovies, garlic, and lemon juice, creating a creamy dressing that coated every leaf of romaine. Diners trusted the spectacle completely, never questioning whether those eggs had been inspected or tested for bacteria that could turn a fancy dinner into a medical emergency. Restaurants prided themselves on this showmanship, treating the raw egg as a mark of authenticity rather than a hazard. Families celebrated special occasions around these salads, and everyone cleaned their plates without a single worry. But salmonella outbreaks eventually forced regulators to examine raw egg preparations in commercial kitchens. Today, most restaurants either pasteurize their eggs, skip the yolk entirely, or face strict health code scrutiny for serving anything uncooked. The dramatic tableside Caesar that once impressed generations of diners is now a liability most kitchens refuse to risk. Shoney's was Sunday morning wrapped in vinyl booths and the smell of bacon grease, a place where families could gather after church or before a long drive and eat until nobody could move. The breakfast bar was the stuff of neighborhood legend, stacked with scrambled eggs, sausage links, pancakes, biscuits, and gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in without tipping over. Kids loved the strawberry topping station and the waffle irons that hissed and steamed when the batter hit the hot surface. Parents appreciated the coffee that kept coming without anyone asking for a refill, cup after cup until the morning felt manageable again. There was a rhythm to Shoney's that made everyone feel at home, a simplicity that never tried to be anything more than exactly what it was. The big boy statue out front greeted every family like an old friend, his checkered overalls and burger held high in frozen celebration. Poor families did not have to pretend at Shoney's because everyone there understood what it meant to stretch a dollar until it screamed. It was the kind of place where a full stomach mattered more than appearances, and that honesty made every visit feel like a small victory against the weak. Self-serve salad bars without sneeze guards or temperature controls were the pride of family restaurants in the 1970s, stretching across dining rooms like colorful gardens of lettuce, tomatoes, and mysterious creamy dressings. People loved the freedom to pile their plates high, returning again and again without anyone monitoring how long the food had been sitting out. Kids reached across bowls with bare hands, adults sampled items directly from serving spoons, and nobody thought twice about the hours those vegetables spent at room temperature. The dressings sat in open containers, sometimes crusted at the edges, sometimes topped with a film that regulars simply stirred away. Restaurants trusted the honor system, believing customers would use tongs instead of fingers. What nobody discussed was how quickly bacteria multiplied in unrefrigerated conditions, or how easily one sick customer could contaminate an entire spread. Today, food safety codes require sneeze guards, temperature monitoring, and constant supervision for any self-serve station. The carefree salad bar of the 70s has been replaced by barriers and regulations designed to prevent the illnesses nobody saw coming. Ponderosa Steakhouse was the kind of place where a family of 5 could walk in with $20 and walk out stuffed beyond reason, and in the 1980s that felt like striking gold. The buffet stretched across the center of the restaurant like a promise that nobody would leave hungry, no matter how tight things were at home. Parents loaded plates with mashed potatoes, green beans, and slices of roast beef, while kids made straight for the soft serve machine, filling bowls until the ice cream curled over the edges. Nobody judged how many times you went back, and that freedom meant everything to families who spent the rest of the week measuring portions carefully. The decor was rustic in that way only the 80s could pull off, with wood paneling and cowboy-themed art that made even a strip mall feel like the open frontier. Waitresses refilled drinks without being asked, and the smell of sizzling steak drifted through the air like a quiet celebration of survival. For many families, Ponderosa was not just a restaurant. It was proof that once in a while, even when money was tight, everyone could eat like kings. Smoking sections separated only by a sign or a half wall were once considered the polite compromise between smokers and non-smokers in the 1970s. Families sat down to dinner just a few feet away from tables clouded in cigarette haze, trusting that an invisible barrier somehow protected them from drifting smoke. Restaurants placed small signs on posts or roped off corners with decorative partitions that did absolutely nothing to stop the smell or the particles floating through the air. Waitresses carried trays past ashtrays overflowing with crushed butts, and nobody batted an eye because this was simply how dining worked. Children ate their meals while adults at nearby tables lit up between courses, filling the room with fog that clung to hair and clothes long after the check was paid. People genuinely believed that sitting in the non-smoking section meant breathing clean air, even when the smoke visibly curled over the divider. Today, indoor smoking in restaurants is banned almost everywhere, and the idea of lighting a cigarette near someone else's dinner seems completely unthinkable to modern diners. Perkins was the kind of restaurant where time seemed to slow down, where families could linger over stacks of pancakes and endless coffee without anyone rushing them toward the door. The syrup came in those little metal pitchers that stayed warm, and kids loved watching the golden streams pool across butter-soaked cakes. Parents appreciated the senior discounts, the kids' menu shaped like a fun activity sheet, and the waitresses who remembered your order after just a few visits. The pies spinning slowly in the glass case by the register were works of art, towering with meringue or layered with fruit that glistened under the lights. Many families made Perkins their Sunday tradition, a place to gather after church or before visiting relatives. The booths were comfortable enough to sink into, and the background noise of clinking dishes and quiet conversation created a rhythm that felt like home. For families counting pennies, Perkins offered a chance to slow down and enjoy each other without watching the clock. It was affordable comfort wrapped in checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh coffee brewing. Cafeterias using shared serving utensils without sanitation were the backbone of affordable dining in the 1970s, where the same ladle or spoon passed through hundreds of hands each day without ever seeing a sink between uses. Customers shuffled down the line, grabbed whatever utensil was sitting in the food, served themselves, and dropped it back for the next person. The system felt efficient and communal, a practical solution for feeding crowds quickly. Nobody thought about germs traveling from hand to handle to food in an endless loop of contamination. Workers occasionally wiped utensils on their aprons if something looked grimy, but formal sanitation protocols did not exist. Families ate together at long tables, never suspecting the serving spoon and the mashed potatoes had been touched by dozens of unwashed hands that hour. Today, health codes require regular utensil rotation, sanitation stations, and strict handling procedures that would have seemed excessive to cafeteria crowds of the 70s. The shared spoon that once symbolized community dining is now recognized as a vector for illness that modern regulations refuse to tolerate. Ground Round was the restaurant where peanut shells covered the floor and nobody told you to clean up your mess, a novelty that made kids feel like rebels and parents feel like they were getting away with something. The free popcorn arrived before the menus, warm and salty, passed around the table until fingers were slick with butter and everyone was already half full. Burgers came on wooden boards, fries spilled across the table, and the whole atmosphere encouraged a kind of casual chaos that felt like a party even on ordinary Tuesday nights. Kids threw peanut shells with gleeful abandon, crunching across the floor on trips to the bathroom or the jukebox. Parents relaxed in ways they rarely could at fancier places, knowing that nobody expected perfection and nobody cared about crumbs. For families watching every dollar, Ground Round offered an experience that felt indulgent without the price tag to match. The food was simple, the vibe was easy, and the memories of crunching through that shell-covered floor stayed with people long after the chain faded from the landscape. It was permission to be messy, and that meant everything. Cafeterias using shared serving utensils without sanitation were the backbone of affordable dining in the 1970s, where the same ladle or spoon passed through hundreds of hands each day without ever seeing a sink between uses. Customers shuffled down the line, grabbed whatever utensil was sitting in the food, served themselves, and dropped it back for the next person. The system felt efficient and communal, a practical solution for feeding crowds quickly. Nobody thought about germs traveling from hand to handle to food in an endless loop of contamination. Workers occasionally wiped utensils on their aprons if something looked grimy, but formal sanitation protocols did not exist. Families ate together at long tables, never suspecting the serving spoon and the mashed potatoes had been touched by dozens of unwashed hands that hour. Today, health codes require regular utensil rotation, sanitation stations, and strict handling procedures that would have seemed excessive to cafeteria crowds of the 70s. The shared spoon that once symbolized community dining is now recognized as a vector for illness that modern regulations refuse to tolerate. Quincy's family. Steakhouse was the kind of place where you could smell the grill from the parking lot and know exactly what kind of meal was waiting inside those glass doors. The buffet stretched along one wall like a promise kept, loaded with fried okra, macaroni and cheese, yeast rolls, and soft-serve ice cream that swirled endlessly from the machine. Parents ordered the cheapest steak on the menu and then made up the difference at the buffet, teaching their kids the quiet art of maximizing value without ever saying the words out loud. The mascot, a cheerful cartoon character named Yolanda, greeted families from posters and napkins and the sides of high chairs, giving the whole place a warmth that felt intentional and welcoming. Waitresses called everyone honey or sweetheart and never rushed a table, even when the dinner crowd swelled and the kitchen tickets piled up. For families who rarely ate out, Quincy's was a treat that felt earned, a reward for making it through another week of hard work and careful budgeting. The steaks were thin, the salad bar was legendary, and the feeling of fullness lasted long after the drive home ended. Fondue restaurants with open flame pots at every table captured the spirit of the 1970s perfectly, inviting diners to gather around bubbling cheese or hot oil while managing their own tabletop burners without supervision. Guests adjusted fuel levels, leaned over flames to dip bread or meat, and sometimes knocked pots sideways in the excitement of communal cooking. The flames danced just inches from napkins, sleeves, and long hair that hung dangerously close during enthusiastic reaching. Restaurants handed over the cooking responsibility entirely, trusting customers to handle fire safely despite having no training with open fuel sources. Children participated eagerly, waving fondue forks near flames that could easily catch stray clothing or splash hot oil. People saw it as interactive, romantic, and wonderfully modern, never stopping to consider how quickly things could go wrong. Today, fire codes and liability concerns have dramatically changed how fondue is served, with many restaurants switching to electric warmers or limiting open flames to controlled kitchen areas. The freewheeling tabletop fires of the 70s are now viewed as hazards rather than charming entertainment. Showbiz Pizza Place was the magical chaos that every kid in the 1980s dreamed about. A wonderland where animatronic animals sang on stage while pizza grease dripped down chins and quarters disappeared into arcade machines. Parents tolerated the noise because it bought them an hour of peace, a chance to sit in a booth and watch their children run wild through a room designed for maximum overstimulation. The Rock-afire Explosion Band performed on a stage that seemed impossibly high-tech at the time, with mechanical bears, gorillas, and mice moving their mouths in time to songs that echoed off the walls. Kids stood hypnotized, clutching half-eaten slices while the show played on loop after loop. Birthday parties meant crowded tables, paper crowns, and the strange pride of being the center of attention in a room full of strangers. The pizza itself was forgettable, but that was never really the point. For families who could not afford theme parks or expensive outings, Showbiz was the next best thing, a place where kids could feel like the world revolved around them for just a few hours. It was loud, sticky, and absolutely unforgettable. Buffets holding hot food without monitored temperature logs were a staple of family dining in the 1970s, offering endless variety from steam tables that nobody checked with a thermometer. Restaurants filled trays with meatballs, gravy, mashed potatoes, and mystery casseroles, trusting the steam alone to keep everything safe. Staff refilled containers by dumping fresh food on top of old, mixing batches that had been sitting for hours with ingredients just pulled from the kitchen. People loaded their plates without wondering how long the fried chicken had been holding or whether the temperature had dropped into the danger zone where bacteria thrive. The buffet felt abundant and generous, a symbol of plenty that asked no questions about food safety. What diners could not see was how easily pathogens multiplied when temperatures fluctuated or trays sat too long between replenishing. Today, health inspectors require documented temperature logs, time limits on holding food, and strict protocols for replacing rather than topping off containers. The guesswork buffets of the 70s have been replaced by thermometers and paperwork that would have baffled the crowds of that era. Sambo's was a name that echoed across American highways throughout the 1970s and into the early 80s, a pancake chain that seemed as permanent as the sunrise until suddenly it was not. Families stopped there for short stacks and scrambled eggs, trusting the familiar orange and brown decor and the coffee that never stopped flowing. Kids loved the tiger mascot that appeared on menus and placemats, a character tied to a children's story that would later become the chain's undoing. Parents appreciated the prices, the speed, and the fact that nobody minded when toddlers made a mess of syrup and shredded napkins. The restaurants dotted interstates and small-town main streets alike, becoming part of the rhythm of road trips and lazy weekend mornings. But as awareness grew about the painful origins of the name and imagery, the chain began a slow and painful collapse. Locations closed one by one, rebranded or simply abandoned, until the name itself became a relic of a less thoughtful era. For those who remember eating there, the pancakes were ordinary, but the disappearance was unforgettable, a reminder that even beloved places can carry baggage too heavy to survive. Restaurants with asbestos ceiling tiles over dining areas were everywhere in the 1970s. Their textured white surfaces absorbing sound while slowly releasing fibers into the air that diners breathed with every bite. Owners installed these tiles because they were cheap, fireproof, and excellent at reducing clatter during peak hours. Nobody imagined that the material keeping noise down was capable of causing devastating lung diseases decades later. Families celebrated birthdays beneath those ceilings, couples shared romantic dinners under softly lit tiles, and workers spent entire shifts surrounded by material that would eventually be classified as a known carcinogen. The tiles looked clean and modern, fitting perfectly with the era's design preferences. When asbestos dangers became public knowledge, restaurants faced enormous costs to safely remove every contaminated tile. Many establishments closed rather than pay for abatement. The acoustic panels that once made dining pleasant became symbols of an era that built comfort on foundations nobody understood were dangerous, until it was far too late. Howard Johnson's was the orange-roofed promise that appeared along every highway, a signal to tired families that rest, food, and clean bathrooms waited just off the next exit. The restaurants were famous for their 28 flavors of ice cream, a number that seemed impossibly exotic to kids who usually only saw vanilla and chocolate at home. Parents ordered fried clam strips or simple burgers, trusting the familiar menu that never changed no matter which state they passed through. The consistency was the comfort, knowing that the mashed potatoes in Florida would taste exactly like the mashed potatoes in Ohio. Families on road trips stopped at Howard Johnson's the way sailors once looked for lighthouses, trusting the brand to deliver exactly what it promised. The booths were wide enough for restless kids to sprawl out, and the waitresses had perfected the art of keeping coffee cups full without interrupting conversation. For poor families driving toward relatives or new jobs, Howard Johnson's was a small luxury that made long journeys bearable. It was dependability wrapped in orange and blue, a place where even travelers on tight budgets could feel like they belonged. Fast food chains cooking with trans fat oils dominated the 1970s, filling fryers with partially hydrogenated oils that made French fries crispy and chicken golden in ways that seemed almost magical. Restaurants loved these oils because they lasted longer, cost less, and produced consistent results customers craved week after week. The fries from your favorite burger joint tasted the same every visit because the oil never changed and the formula never varied. Families drove through for dinner without any idea that the delicious coating on their food was slowly clogging arteries with every bite. Scientists had not yet connected trans fats to heart disease, and the information would have seemed impossible given how ubiquitous these oils had become. Every fast food kitchen in America ran on the same dangerous formula, serving millions of meals that tasted like progress but carried hidden costs. Today, trans fats have been effectively banned from commercial food preparation, and the crispy perfection of 70s fast food exists only in memory. The oil that once defined an industry became one of its greatest public health regrets. They called it fast food. Nobody mentioned how fast the regulations were falling behind. If this shocked you, like and subscribe for more.